Hey class, today we're going to be talking about protests, particularly civil rights movement protests and advancements that were made through protest, and some of the challenges that protesters faced. So we're going to hop right into it. Yesterday we had talked about sit-ins, and I had said that sit-ins were very effective as far as a way to protest. So I want to talk about how the sit-in movement gained popularity and why it was effective. So in February of 1960, there were four African American college students, and they were in Greensboro. And they had talked about this for a while, but they decided that they were going to go into a store called Woolworths. And I don't know if you know the history of Woolworths or not, but it was a chain store, and we had talked about chain stores back when we talked about the early 1900s. And chain stores, kind of like a Walmart would be, or Macy's, or something like that. It actually would be something more like a Walgreens ish. But Woolworths sold goods, and they also served people food and things like that. And so these four college students went in, they bought some goods that they needed, and they sat at a counter and they wanted to receive service in the whites only section. These four African American college students, and when they do this, they are refused service. So the server will not serve them at the whites only section. So they say, we're going to sit here all day, and we're going to come back every day and sit here all day until you serve us. And so when people find out about this, by the way, they do stay there all day. And so they keep their word. And this is a very bold move, by the way. It might sound like, oh, what's the big deal? It's a big deal, right? They're going to face. I mean, think about that. In an era they could face, in an era where there's racism abounding and segregation is a legal thing, they can face, first of all, just being kicked out of the store. They can face being assaulted by people who are angry about what they're doing. They can face arrest. So they're taking a big risk. Word spreads, and as word spreads, the people that participate in their movement at that store grows. And as that movement at that store grows, word spreads to other areas in the nation. So by the end of 1961, this started as in one store in one city. Four people decide to do this. Okay, this is how grassroots movements work, and I think it's what's so cool about grassroots movements is that when it catches on, it can spread really quickly, and it's very easy to replicate. All you do is just do what the other people were doing that was successful, right? So it starts with four people in one city. And by the end of 1961, it had spread to over 100 cities and tons of stores in those 100 cities. So what starts as one store in one city spreads across the nation, and a lot of stores are facing the challenge of desegregating and being forced by public pressure to desegregate. So it's like a one at a time movement, and every little victory counts, right? And that's a really big deal. And the sit-in protests and the press that they garner, because anytime you're trying to change a nation's mind, getting good press is a big deal. And so the press that this garners is huge. And also just the public support that is gained by the bravery of the people who are willing to risk a lot to do this is huge. So it's a very successful movement. It's a very big deal. And these sit-in protests are extremely successful. So much so that so this is something that unions had used, and now the African American community is using. And then people in the later 60s are going to use this for other political purposes because it was so successful here. Okay, another thing to talk about is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So the SNCC, it is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It's a big deal for several reasons. One is because of, first of all, the emphasis on nonviolence. That's the hallmark of the civil rights movement. The hallmark of the civil rights movement, and why the civil rights movement was so successful, is that it was a nonviolent movement. One of the reasons why, when we look back at the union movement in the 1800s, it was very unsuccessful, or at least very mildly successful because a lot of times when unions started making gains, violence would occur. So there would be some kind of rioting and people would be killed, and then any popular support that the union had gained in America would just disappear because people don't like it when movements turn violent. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a nonviolent movement, which means it's probably going to gain support. But the problem, there's always a problem, is that they can be victimized, right? Which they were. But they helped African Americans register to vote, and they gave African Americans voter education. And there's a big pushback against this in the South. So we see, for example, in 1964, members of the KKK murdered 3 SNCC workers. So when I said this is risky, I mean this is risky, because there are people who lose their lives trying to support the civil rights movement. All right. So there's a lot of risk involved, and people that weren't murdered, some people were beaten and other things like that occurred. Intimidation occurred. So there is risk to this, but there are gains being made for the civil rights movement. And we see that the sit-ins are successful, and the SNCC successfully helps to register African American voters and give voter education. And then we see another group of people, which is it's a really cool group that is called the Freedom Riders. And if you remember back to yesterday's lesson, the Supreme Court's going to rule in 1956 that busing needs to be desegregated. That segregating busing based on race is unconstitutional. Well, a lot of bus lines in a lot of cities in the South are just not complying with this. So the Freedom Riders, they organize things called Freedom Rides, where they are going to, and by the way, we start seeing this really take off in 1961. So they are going to push for people to ride on segregated busing and challenge this segregation in person, kind of like a sit-in only on the bus, right? And a lot of bad things happen to Freedom Riders. So a lot of them are persecuted, and I'm not talking like religious persecution, but like they are verbally assaulted. Like they're called all kinds of names. They're screamed at. They're yelled at. They're pushed. People start throwing rocks at them. They're falsely arrested. There's a group of Freedom Riders that actually gets beaten by police in the South and go to jail for failing to comply with unconstitutional segregation laws. But they ultimately succeed. See, big risk, big reward here, right? Some people have to suffer a lot for this, but by 1962, they succeed in desegregating a lot of the busing in the South. So most bus lines are going to be desegregated by 1962, largely thanks to efforts from the Freedom Riders, who get a lot of press, again, around this idea of desegregating busing. Another big thing I want to talk about today, which is going to segue into tomorrow's lesson, is the Birmingham demonstrations in 1963. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize protests. He's really a massively important figure in the civil rights movement. And I don't even know that his importance can be overstated at all in the civil rights movement. He's just such an iconic figure in the movement. And he's such a powerful speaker, and he's such a uniting force in the community that he just is able to speak to the hearts and the minds of people in America and get them on board with the civil rights movement. So in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to help organize demonstrations in Birmingham. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be arrested because of these demonstrations. Now, I mean, if you look at the First Amendment, right, there are 5 rights that are protected by the First Amendment, and one of them is the right to peaceably assemble. So Martin Luther King Jr. and those that were demonstrating had the constitutional right to do what they were doing, but their constitutional right is violated, and they are arrested. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to pen a very powerful letter. It's the letter from Birmingham jail, right? and he is going to state his case for why what they're doing in the civil rights movement is so important, and why not complying with unjust laws is a duty. He's going to make the case that it's not just enough to not comply, but that everyone has a duty to not comply. So it's not like, you can, you can't. But if there's an unjust law, that it's the people's duty to not comply. And he's making his case for why he is not complying with unjust laws, because he caught flack because he's a pastor and he's in jail. And some people are saying, well, you didn't comply with the law and you're in jail. Well, it's your fault. And he's saying, no, it's not my fault. It's society making unjust laws, and I have a duty to not comply, and so do you. It's not just me. You, reader, you, American, have a duty to not comply with these unjust laws. And it's a very motivational letter, and it really helps gain momentum for the civil rights movement. So I'm not going to cover more material now. I'm going to end here because I think it's a really important point to end at. I just want to review. All right, so things that we want to make sure we've got a grasp on in today's lesson. First of all, general protests. Protests were effective. When done correctly, nonviolence, right? When done correctly, protests are huge, and they can be incredibly powerful. Sit-ins were very effective, just a grassroots movement of people choosing to sit in segregated sections of stores and force them to desegregate by not moving. It was very effective. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee made gains in the civil rights movement by helping to register African Americans to vote and giving voter education, but they were met with violence and even murder. But they did help advance the civil rights movement. The Freedom Riders forced busing companies in the South to desegregate by sit-in protests on the bus, by riding on buses in busing companies in areas where segregation was still a thing, even though it was technically not legal anymore. And then Dr. Martin Luther King organizing protests in Birmingham, being arrested, and then penning his very powerful letter from a Birmingham jail. So those are all things that are going to push toward the culmination that we're going to see in tomorrow's lesson of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Civil Rights Act of 65. All right, well, that is it for today. I appreciate you guys watching, and I appreciate all the solid work that you all are doing. If you have any questions for me, email me anytime, and I look forward to tomorrow's lesson.